I've known Adrian for years. We met in college, bonding over a shared love of bad horror movies and late-night diner runs, and we never really lost touch. Adrian was the kind of friend you could call at 2 a.m. with a stupid question, and he'd answer like it was the most normal thing in the world. But lately, something about Adrian seemed off. It started small. He never seemed to age. While I agonized over new wrinkles in the mirror and my increasingly creaky knees, Adrian stayed the same. Smooth skin, bright eyes, the same youthful energy he'd had at 25. Then there were the stories. Adrian always told these wild, detailed tales about places he'd been and things he'd seen. Ancient ruins, long-lost cities, wars fought centuries ago. At first, I thought he was just a history buff. But the way he talked about it, it was too vivid, too personal. Like he'd actually been there. The truth came out during one of our usual late-night hangouts. Adrian had invited me over, promising to cook dinner. We'd been joking about something stupid. A meme, maybe, when I asked a throwaway question. You ever wish you could go back in time? He froze, his hand hovering over a wine glass. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he let out a short, humorless laugh. I don't need to, he said quietly. What do you mean? I asked, frowning. Adrian turned to face me, his expression unreadable. I've already been there. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. But the look on his face stopped me cold. He wasn't joking. I'm older than you think, Adrian said, his voice steady but heavy, like the weight of his words was crushing him. A lot older. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. It never came. How old? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, then met my gaze. About 1,000 years. I laughed again, but this time it was nervous. Come on, Adrian. Be serious. I am. Over the next few hours, Adrian told me everything. He spoke about walking through the streets of ancient Constantinople, about the scent of spices and bustling markets and the golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia. He described surviving the Black Plague, the sheer terror of watching entire villages wiped out in days. He told me about loves he'd lost, partners who grew old and died while he stayed the same, friends who noticed he didn't age and began to fear him, townspeople who called him a witch, forcing him to flee in the dead of night. The more he talked, the more I believed him. It wasn't just the stories, it was the way Adrian spoke, the weight of his words. He wasn't telling me things he'd read in a history book. He was reliving them. But as awe gave way to curiosity, I noticed something else: sadness. Adrian's voice would crack when he spoke about certain events. His eyes would grow distant, haunted, like he was seeing something I couldn't. There was pain in his stories. And guilt. After that night, I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. Adrian never used his real name when we went out. Every few years, he'd pack up and move to a new city, leaving behind friends and jobs like they were disposable. He avoided certain places, graveyards, old churches, and grew visibly uncomfortable when we passed them. Once we were walking downtown when Adrian suddenly stopped, his face pale. I followed his gaze to a man sitting on a bench across the street. The man looked ordinary enough, but Adrian grabbed my arm and yanked me into an alley. What are you doing? I hissed. Quiet, he whispered, his eyes darting around. We need to go. Why? Who was that? Adrian didn't answer. He just pulled me along, his grip tight. Eventually, I confronted him. Who was that guy on the bench? I asked one night. And don't tell me it's nothing, because I know you're lying. Adrian sighed, rubbing his temples. There are people who know what I am, he said finally. People who've been hunting me for centuries. Hunting you? Why? He hesitated, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Because immortality isn't free. What does that mean? Adrian didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. It means I've made enemies. And some debts don't go away no matter how long you run. The next time I saw the man on the bench, he wasn't alone. Adrian and I were sitting at a cafe when I spotted him across the street, standing with a group of people in dark coats. They're here, Adrian whispered, his face pale. Who are they? I asked, panic rising in my chest. Adrian grabbed my hand, his grip firm. We need to leave. Now. We didn't make it far. As we rounded the corner, one of them stepped into our path. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to gleam in the dim light. Adrian, he said, his voice smooth and cold. It's been a long time. Adrian pushed me behind him, his body tense. Leave her out of this, he said. The man tilted his head, a cruel smile playing on his lips. I'm not here for her. I'm here for you. What do you want? Adrian asked, his voice tight. You know what I want, the man said. It's time to pay your debt. Adrian didn't respond. His hand trembled at his side, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I'm not going back." The man's smile widened. "Then I'll take her instead." Before I could process his words, Adrian stepped forward, his face hard with resolve. "No," he said. "You won't touch her." The man's smile faltered. "You'd sacrifice yourself for this human?" Adrian didn't answer. He just turned to me, his eyes soft. "I'm sorry," he said. "For everything." Before I could respond, Adrian stepped into the man's shadow. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole, and just like that he was gone. I thought Adrian was gone for good. The cafe, the shadowy figures, the way he disappeared into nothing. It felt final. For weeks, I kept replaying that night in my head, trying to figure out if there was something I could have done differently. But then, strange things started happening. It began with a letter. No return address, no stamps, just my name scrawled across the front in Adrian's handwriting. Inside was a single line. "Stay away from them. They'll come for you next." The letter sent a chill down my spine. Who were they? The men in coats? The ones hunting Adrian? Or something else entirely? I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that my grief was making me see things that weren't there. But that was before the second letter arrived. This time it was a single sentence. "You're part of this now." The first time I saw one of them, I thought I was imagining it. I was walking home late one night when I noticed a man in a long black coat standing at the edge of the street. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. At first I thought he was just some random stranger. But as I turned onto my block, I glanced back and saw him again, standing at the corner watching me. The next day I saw another one. A woman this time, her coat the same shade of black, her eyes cold and unblinking. It didn't take long to realize they were everywhere. On buses, in parks, outside my apartment. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just watched. It was almost midnight when I heard the knock at my door. My heart raced as I approached, half expecting to see one of the watchers waiting on the other side. Instead, I opened the door to find Adrian. He looked different. Tired, like he hadn't slept in years. His clothes were torn, his hair unkempt, but it was him. "Adrian," I whispered, relief washing over me. "I don't have much time," he said, stepping inside and locking the door behind him. "They're coming." "Who are they?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What do they want from me?" Adrian hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "They're part of the price," he said finally. "The cost of what I am." "I'm not like you," I said. "I didn't make a deal. I didn't ask for anything." "No," Adrian said softly. "But you're connected to me now. And that makes you a target?" We sat at my kitchen table as Adrian explained. "They're not people," he said. "Not really. They're something older, something hungry. They hunt people like me, people who've cheated death. And anyone close to me becomes part of their game." I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. "So what happens now? What do I do?" Adrian looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or sorrow. "You have two choices," he said. "You can run, but they'll find you eventually. Or what?" I pressed. Adrian leaned back, his eyes heavy. "Or I can make you like me." The room fell silent. "You can't be serious," I said. "I am," Adrian replied. "It's the only way to survive. But if you choose this, there's no going back. Immortality isn't what you think it is. It's not freedom, it's a prison." Before I could answer, the lights in my apartment flickered. The air grew heavy and a faint whisper filled the room. "They're here," Adrian said, standing up abruptly. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to ripple, stretching and twisting until they formed figures, dark, indistinct shapes with glowing eyes. Adrian grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "We have to move." We sprinted through the city, the watchers following close behind. They didn't run. They didn't need to. They moved through the shadows like smoke, appearing wherever the light didn't touch. Adrian led me to an abandoned warehouse, slamming the door shut behind us. He turned to face me, his expression grim. "This is it," he said. "You have to choose. If you want to live, you have to trust me." The watchers were closing in, their whispers growing louder, their forms pressing against the edges of the warehouse. "I don't want this," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't want to be like you." Adrian nodded, his face softening. "I know. But it's the only way." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small vial filled with a dark, swirling liquid. "What is that?" I asked. "It's the same thing I took," Adrian said. "It'll make you like me. But once you take it, there's no going back. You'll live forever, but you'll never be free." The watchers were pounding on the walls now, their voices rising to a deafening roar. I didn't have time to think. Adrian handed me the vial, his hand steady. "It's your choice," he said. I looked at the vial, then at Adrian, then at the shadows creeping closer. And I drank it. The transformation was instant. The moment the liquid hit my tongue, a wave of fire surged through my veins. My vision blurred, my heart pounding as my body seemed to split in two. The Watchers stopped. They stepped back, their whispers fading into silence. Adrian grabbed my shoulders, his eyes searching mine. "How do you feel?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt something stir inside me, something cold and ancient, something that wasn't there before. Adrian's expression darkened. "Oh no," he whispered. "What?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You didn't just take immortality," he said. "You took his place." I stared at him, confused. "Whose place?" "The one who comes for us," Adrian said. "The one who hunts immortals. You're not like me now. You're like them." I looked down at my hands, watching as shadows curled around my fingers, sinking into my skin. And in that moment I realized the truth. I hadn't escaped the Watchers. I had become one of them.